Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host Peter Lavelle in Moscow and Jeremy Nell in South Africa, and to welcome our main guest, Kit Klarenberg. Kit, you're based in Belgrade. You've been on the show before, and you are pursuing an absolutely extraordinary journalistic career as I think probably the main source of information about the British Secret Services, those same Secret Services who are mythologized by James Bond, but who, according to you, play a role that's absolutely key in world events. I'm sure many of our viewers already know your writing. I'm just looking back at your most recent pieces. You published, I think, yesterday, about how the MI6 infiltrated the International Atomic Agency, Atomic Energy Agency, which of course is very much in the news. Shortly before that, you did a piece also for the Grey Zone about MI6's, or the British anyway, plan to defeat the entire Russian Black Fleet. You're an expert on this. Is MI6 or SIS or whatever we call them, GCHQ and so on, are they really at the center of everything, Kit? Some people would say that Mossad or the CIA were the most powerful agencies, but you seem to put the finger on the British. Go ahead, Kit.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that we've discussed this. There's a bit of an echo, I might add, but we've discussed this before on the show, and I believe that Peter respectfully raised some skepticism about my position, which is completely reasonable. But I think that what a lot of people miss is, yes, the UK ever since World War II has effectively been a satellite of the US, and it has been dependent on US military power, on US wealth, on US diplomatic clout to exert its influence. However, in that context, when you are completely dependent on the US empire's existence to maintain your own relevance and influence globally, of course, you will invest all of your energy into maintaining US hegemony. And so I think that what my work tracks is numerous examples, both old and new, of the UK attempting via manipulation, via other nefarious, malign means, to bounce the US into trying to do its bidding. And it's very, very clear, based on leaked emails and documents that we've reported on at the Grey Zone, that there is in the Ukraine context, as an example, there is a widespread perception among the Britain's military and intelligence elite that America has not gone in hard enough, like in respect of the proxy war against Russia, and they openly state that this is something that we need to counter at all costs, and we need to get the US more heavily involved in this. And in that context, not only does this lead to the British being the masterminds, a contradiction in terms, of disasters like Krinky and the Kursk incursion and the 2023 counteroffensive. This was all, British encouraged, British armed, British directed, British orchestrated. And the purpose over and over again was to get the US more involved in this, due to the perception that they weren't sufficiently invested. Now, we've just heard from Politico that the US has cut not only all future military aid for Ukraine, but also shipments that were promised under Biden, which is like quite a significant pullback on this. And I would imagine the British are absolutely up in arms. As I have reported on extensively for the Grey Zone, there is a secret British Ministry of Defence cell called Project Alchemy. Within days of the proxy war erupting, they put together detailed plans for to, quote unquote, keep Ukraine fighting at all costs. And to a large extent, the conflict over the past 3.5 years has played out according to a script drawn up in February 2022 in London. often by people with absolutely zero battlefield experience whatsoever. I mean, in a bitter irony, like one of the people that Project Alchemy consulted was an expert on the Napoleonic Wars. And we all know how that ended. But yeah, but I think that, so yes, the reason that I focus on Britain is because they occupy this interesting role, to say the least, where they are a vassal. They are an ally, quote unquote, of the US, who will say how high when asked to jump. But there is a lot of scope within that for manipulation, for subversion, for attempting to, yes, get the US to do their dirty work for them. And this is often frequently spelled out in both the classified and leaked files that I've reported on.
Well, Kit, to follow up on what you were saying, I mean, if the and I agree with you, the British are up in arms about the reports coming from Politico and administration officials that we see no new appropriation for Ukraine coming up. They're using up the last of the Biden allotment, and because of the other foreign policy priorities called Israel, Ukraine is not going to continue with the arms transfers. But if we follow through with your thesis, then we should be expecting a false flag by the British intelligence in Ukraine. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this, I mean, so to give you an example of this precise phenomenon, sorry, in action, in October 2022, the Ukrainian security services pulled off the bombing of Kerch Bridge, and that I have reported on extensive classified British documentation where they have all of these fantasies of blowing up the entire structure, and without any consideration for civilian casualties. On the same day that this attack was carried out, and we had all of these Ukrainian officials saying "Happy birthday, Putin," because it happened to be the Russian president's birthday on the day. On that very same day, Chris Donnelly, this veteran British NATO advisor and Ministry of Defence apparatchik, he was in discussions via private email with senior British military officials, where, as I say, he was talking about we need to counter US hesitance to get involved at once. Now, the upshot of the Kerch Bridge bombing was that Russia started targeting Ukrainian infrastructure for the very first time. And it has been reported that Pentagon officials were, quote unquote, baffled at how gentle the Russians had been in terms of targeting even bridges and other, which the US in a shock and awe campaign would have taken out within 24 hours of an intervention beginning. Now, we must ask ourselves, was that the Kerch Bridge bombing carried out with the expectation that there would be escalation from Russia, and in turn, that this would drag the Americans deeper and deeper into this? The problem with this strategy is, as I mentioned, it appears the US has very little left to give, if anything. And this is something I've been writing about for 18 months now. There are official Pentagon reports which are in the public domain, where they talk about how, well, the munition demands created both by the Ukraine war, but also the Gaza genocide, are completely unsustainable, and the US does not have the defense industrial base or the procurement facilities to replenish what has been sent at any pace or scale. Like, it's very, very clear that even if we do have a false flag, and I mean, it's a horrifying prospect, but a very real one, I don't think the US can give anything else at this stage. Like, I mean, Britain has been reduced to buying Ukraine drones from the US in bulk. Like, that's their sole defensive measure left to them. So, I mean, I've said this many times, but as disturbing as the European, particularly British, determination to keep this going, again, quote unquote, at all costs, is, at the same time, there's nothing left in the tank. Like, I mean, what would a false flag result in? I mean, I guess there's the nuclear option, But in terms of sending more, artillery shells, more tanks, like more jets to Ukraine, it's not going to happen. And they are left with. I mean, Churchill, towards the end of World War II, he begged FDR not to abandon Europe because he said, "You will be leaving us shackled to a corpse." And I think that that's where we're at now, really.
What? How do you've said that the British essentially are conducting what are ultimately low-scale sabotage operations designed to produce reprisals. That's what you've implied when your reference to the Kerch Bridge event, and perhaps also to the counteroffensive of 2023. Are you then saying that that's all these British services can do? Because I mentioned Mossad in my brief introduction. We I'm sure on this show probably agree that what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is absolutely horrific. But I think everyone also agrees, or at least I suggest that you may agree, that the Beeper operation, the Hezbollah Beeper operation, was a spectacular operation, a spectacular success, albeit in a very horrible way. Are the British capable of that kind of level of operation, or are they just trying to raise the profile of Britain with their sabotage operations?
Well, I mean, if we look back at what happened when there were meant to be peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine pulled off this daring strike on Russian tactical bombers via Operation Spiderweb, which was allegedly 18 months in the making, and required the smuggling of drones into Ukraine and all sorts of other kind of high stakes skullduggery. What was very interesting was after an initial burst of kind of media exuberance over this, and particularly the British media, I might add, they were like, "Oh, Ukraine's back in the game. They've shown that they don't need the US to help anymore." Like, after about a week of this, suddenly it was admitted that actually its military utility was basically nil. Like, its impact on the battlefield, naught. And we actually, I mean, you mentioned Mossad. Again, in the initial hours or the initial days of Israel's attack on Iran, we had chaos reign supreme on the streets of Tehran. Again, somehow drones were smuggled into the country. Israeli officials were speaking with a high level of braggadocio about where this could lead. We had Netanyahu saying, well, it is very likely that this is going to produce regime change because the government's very weak, and they're going to get the public wants rid of these theological thugs. And then, within days, it was clear they'd bitten off considerably more than they could chew. And the Iranians were battering them, circumventing Israeli air defenses and missile defenses, and causing significant damage to cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa. We don't know the full extent of the military damage because of internal censorship. But it's I think that the British military machine, and indeed British military thinking, has been structured around all sorts of grand, kind of incendiary, high-profile individual acts that actually, from a battlefield perspective, don't really achieve anything. And I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, you said military, but this is intelligence. I mean, is intelligence a substitute for the British military? Because these kind of daring, the Kerch Bridge, and I don't know how much they were involved in the counteroffensive. Everybody was taking credit before, then no one wants to be responsible after the fact. But I mean, is that the value added that Britain add? It's the Americans kind of outsources to some degree. So I'm not really sure, how much agency they have. But if they, the Americans, if they are, as the leader of the empire, they would have a say. But you're saying, there's a lot of outsourcing, there's a lot of freelancing going on. I mean, how do you square that circle?
Well, yeah, sure. So, I mean, like I said, yeah, it does appear that frequently that the US looks to Britain, and I mean, you mentioned the counteroffensive having what's that cliche that success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. Yeah, well, it's like actually there was a report in the Times of London which talked about how Britain encouraged Ukraine to go ahead with the counteroffensive and was very aggressive in doing so. The article referred to Britain as the brains of the proxy war in Ukraine. What the article didn't mention was it was a complete and total disaster. But like you know, as again we've reported at the Grey Zone, the US National Security Council was soliciting advice on strategy from British military intelligence veterans and academics, and in some cases these people were advocating Ukraine adopt ISIS-style tactics to target railway infrastructure, and and indeed use drones packed with explosives for defensive and offensive purposes, which Ukraine has been doing since almost the start of this. So it's clear they do have an influence. Although I would and this is again a point that I've tried to make many times in my journalism, I'm not sure if it's gotten across efficiently, is that these people have a heavily romanticized idea of World War II, for instance. So a perfect example, I mentioned Krinky. Krinky was a absolute disaster where the Ukraine spent 9 months sending wave after wave of British trained and equipped Marines to capture a beachhead in Russian occupied Kherson without any air cover. And it's been reported in Ukrainska Pravda, which is a pro-government, pro-Zelensky publication funded by US aid, actually. The British were hoping that this would recreate D-Day. And what would happen was that the Ukrainians would create a beachhead in Krinky and they would march on Crimea, an outright victory. And it ended in 9 months with God knows how many casualties. It was one of the worst military, it's up there with Gallipoli in terms of military disasters. It's just kind of been forgotten about. Now, again, this was informed by this Hollywood notion of what D-Day was, where which erases any reference to the fact that the entire Nazi, well, the Wehrmacht, the Nazi military had, for the most part, been destroyed by the Red Army by this point, which is why D-Day could go ahead. Likewise, a lot of references in these leaked Project Alchemy files to Special Operations Executive, which was this World War II era kind of black bag sabotage operation where MI6 people would be parachuted behind enemy lines in occupied Europe and work with resistance groups. I mean, there is a huge mythos around the success of SOE. More recent scholarship has concluded that actually it was a bit rubbish, and it didn't really achieve anything, and it certainly wasn't successful in winning wars. But this is what they are copying in order to try and secure victory in the war with Russia.
Well, Kit, I mean, maybe the appropriate, I mean, instead of saying D-Day, I mean, maybe the accurate historical reference is Market Garden.
Oh yeah. Or was that the incursion into France that ended? No, that was the Netherlands. What was the Dieppe raid? Sorry, yes,
a bridge too far.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, there was the Dieppe raid, which was like a preparation for D-Day, where a large number of British soldiers just got killed for no reason. But yeah, they cling to these fantastical ideas. And I think in part that's informed by this enduring sense amongst Britain's ruling elite that they are still this major global power, and that the Battle of Britain represents Britain's finest hour. It has zero relation to actual battlefield reality or how wars are won. And now, I mean, and I'll finish on this point. I'd love to hear from George. I've been perhaps talking too long, but the point is that there was at the end of last year, there was a House of Lords Defense Committee report called Ukraine: A Wake-Up Call that was it was based on extensive interviews with think tank apparatchiks and British military veterans, some serving, some retired, which basically concluded that Britain was totally defenseless and didn't have an army worthy of the name. And in a quote unquote operating environment such as Donbass, which is unlike any war in history, Britain would last a couple of weeks at most. This was completely ignored by the mainstream media, but its findings were absolutely unambiguous that Britain is in real trouble militarily. It does not have the capabilities to fight on any serious scale for any length of time, particularly in the field of like drone warfare or like electronic warfare, which is a significant area of contention between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, Britain is nowhere to be seen on these fronts at all, and its only prescriptions were spend more money. And we fast forward to today, and Mark Rutte with Daddy Trump is cheering how, oh well, by 2030 NATO states will be spending 3.5% of their GDP on defense, which is less than before the Cold War ended, still, as if this is in any way meaningful.
In your last piece, Kit, you wrote about Iran and the. I haven't read the piece yet. Perhaps you can let us know, because that seems to be. If I'm looking at the entry on your Telegram channel now, that does seem to be an example not of a sabotage operation, but instead of a genuine infiltration, a genuine intelligence operation. If what you're saying is true, that the IAEA, many people have commented on this, of course, that the IAEA transmitted secrets to, at least to Israel. But you're saying that it was the British and not the Israelis who managed to infiltrate it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that I mean, I would urge. I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I would urge all of our viewers and listeners to give this a read, because I think it's a perfect example of how Britain operates actually autonomously of the US. So there is it basically covers the activities of this veteran MI6 operative called Nicholas Langman, who was heavily embroiled.
I was at the same college as him. I
know. Oh, really?
I know Nick Langman.
Well, I mean, I think that raises very obvious questions about you, John. Particularly given the introduction.
My cover was blown a long time ago. Don't worry. I hadn't read the article, so I didn't know Nick Langman was in it, but there we are. I'll read it now.
But I mean, he's like a veteran MI6 officer who was implicated in Britain's post 9/11 torture program. Now, we at the Grey Zone got his CV, his official CV, where it states that he was involved in trying to stoke fears internationally of Iran's nuclear capabilities. And then in between 2010 and 2012, he ran Britain's non-proliferation center and was directly coordinating with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Nuclear of chemical weapons, and like if you actually look at the dates in which like the kind of overlap between what he was doing and when. So he was running Britain's counter-proliferation center and trying to quote unquote raise the pressure on Iran around its nuclear program between 2010 and 2012. This is a period where the US, the UN, and the EU all and their proxies like Japan and South Korea, all took very, very harsh measures against Iran, and they imposed sanctions, etc. And this was the basis of the 2015 Obama administration nuclear deal. Now, the questions have to, and it mentions how he coordinated with quote unquote Middle Eastern intelligence agencies on this, and I think there are no prizes for guessing that the agencies in question were based in Israel. Like effectively, this was at a time he was conducting these activities at a time that the U.S. intelligence community had concluded that Iran had no nuclear program, it had no nuclear ambitions, it was not pushing in this direction. And he takes credit in his official CV for instigating the Trump administration's maximum pressure strategy. And it's like the question, the obvious question to ask in this context is, to what extent is the tail wagging the dog here? Like, was he tasked by the US to do this, or were Britain acting, going into business for themselves, so to speak? That is an open question. It's not something that I make a judgment on in my piece, but the facts are there for people to make their own conclusions. And I think, it's very suspicious that you have this veteran MI6 dirty trickster who, yes, on top of being involved in MI6 torture, which was known to elicit false intelligence always, was also posted to Paris during the time that Princess Diana died, and was tasked with running information operations to deflect public's concerns that British intelligence might have been responsible for her death. And it's like he's been burned publicly so many times and yet seems to have failed upwards. Very odd.
So,
go ahead, George.
Yeah, the reason why this thesis is a little hard to grasp, because on all recent foreign military interventions, in the last, let's say, the last couple of decades, it was always the United States that was shaping policy. I mean, if you look at, let's go Yugoslavia, that was shaped by the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright. If you go to the invasion of Iraq, it was shaped by George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. Britain had a walk-on role. They added a little bit of class to the operation. Tony Blair was much better spoken than either Bill Clinton or George W. Bush. He could articulate all his vision of a new world order. And even when we come to more recent times like Ukraine, it's an American policy. It was an American policy that to get Ukraine into NATO. It wasn't the British who were driving this. It was the Americans who were driving it, and everything that Victoria Nuland and the others who kind of, did the whole Maidan thing. And even with Iran, the JCPOA and the determination to leave the JCPOA, to impose the sanctions against Iran, to insist on Iran not having any nuclear enrichment capabilities. That was driven by the Americans. It wasn't driven by the British. The British actually wanted the Americans to stay in the JCPOA. So that's why it's very hard to grasp with like saying, well, this is the British are driving it, when the policy, all of these the policies are always being driven by Washington.
Okay, well, 2 points to make there, George, and I say this with the utmost respect for you and the incredible work you've done on Yugoslavia amongst other topics. Number one, in terms of Iraq, of course, like the MI6 was charged with coming up with the intelligence on the weapons of mass destruction, and many of the most lurid claims of Iraqi WMD capability was sourced by MI6. In July 2004, the Senate Intelligence Committee issued the scathing report on intelligence failures leading up to the war in Iraq, and there is this particular section where it states that the CIA relied too heavily on foreign government services for reporting, thereby increasing the potential for manipulation of US policy by foreign interests, which seems to me a veiled interest interest to MI6. I mean, and also, I mean, in respect of Ukraine, I think we discussed this last time we were on this program. The Maidan coup, which was supported by elements of the U.S. Imperial Brain Trust, a contradiction in terms, if ever there was one. You know, Chris Donnelly, the aforementioned, in July 2014, he gave a presentation to the British Parliament's Defence Select Committee, where he explicitly stated, well, Britain should take the lead on training Ukrainian military forces, which is to say like Azov and Right Sector, you know, these kind of fascist paramilitaries, and doing so is an opportunity to divert the Obama administration's Asia pivot and refocus US attention on Europe and the Middle East. You know, so I mean, it is certainly the case that the interests of the most belligerent individuals or elements within Washington's power structure converge with the British at key points. And I might add as well that Donnelly gave that testimony in July 2014. That same month, a essay was published on the website of his quote-unquote charity, the Institute for Statecraft, which called for diplomatic breach with Russia, for the economic sanctions against Russia, and also black propaganda to demonize Russia, which would quote-unquote produce war of the old-fashioned sort between the West and Russia that Britain could win.
So the British are just doing the dirty work. You know, they're doing the more sordid things that the Americans, you know, they just delegate it to the British.
Yeah, well, I mean, sorry. Just to finish this point real quick. You got to bear in mind that there was a Yahoo News report in 2021 about the CIA's plot to get Julian Assange out of the Ecuadorian embassy and kill him. And there's a section in it where the Americans are reported to have asked the British to do the shooting, and the British agreed. Special relationship.
Yeah, but I mean, Kit, you know, you talked about thwarting the Obama's pivot to Asia. I can see that, but we have this recurring theme of that. Well, there are many members of the intelligence community of the United States say, well, that's what the president wants, but we want to go after Russia. I mean, you can have an official statement, you know, what you want to do, because I tend to look at this as a beehive. You know, I think that there are many people in the American intelligence community and in the British intelligence community. They have affinities. They don't have to articulate it. They don't have to, do you agree with this or no, it's just assumed. It's assumed. And so that's what makes it really blurry. You don't know where something starts and another thing ends, because there is a confluence of goals. And it seems to me that there's kind of a outsourcing of different elements. I could imagine, because it's a beehive, you know, one worker bee over here, one worker, they could be doing something at cross purposes, but in the totality of it all kind of makes sense. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely, and I would say that like the notion which is pushed by some people that like Britain controls the US. I mean, I don't subscribe to that at all. Like at all. I mean, it's just clearly not true. But I mean, as I say, when you are in a position where your international clout and relevance is completely dependent on the maintenance of the US empire, you are going to do everything that you can to maintain US hegemony. And this is actually written, if you look, there are Foreign Office files from the 60s and 70s related to British propaganda efforts in Latin America. Their first stated objective is to maintain US dominance in the region. Like you know, and I think I talked about this on the last program, but it bears repeating that, like, on top of the benefiting from this kind of unipolar US dominated world by token of being America's top lapdog. There are more practical concerns at work as well. So, I mean, with the Falklands War, or sorry, the Malvinas War, forgive me, in 1982, you have this is regarded as kind of plucky underdog British achievement, where they spent weeks traveling across the world via Navy ships, and then they boxed the junta, etc. What nobody knows and doesn't really get reported is they were completely dependent on US support to do this. They required US missiles, US intelligence, refueling at US bases in the Atlantic. Without that, they could have done nothing. So again, when you are so dependent on US hegemony, you will do everything you can to try and maintain it. And I mean, on a smaller level, we see, I mean, I see this in my adopted neck of the woods in the Balkans, where you have a number of countries, if you can even call them that, which are completely dependent on US military occupation to exist. Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo. Like there was a Politico article at the start of last year which stated that the only thing in the way of Serbs reclaiming Kosovo as their own territory, as it is stated in their constitution, is Camp Bondsteel, this massive US military base. Well, when that leaves, and they will leave, eventually, what next? In that context, you are going to be doing everything to try and keep the US there.
Kit, you just said what next? What then is MI6's long game?
I'm not sure they have one. I mean, to be brutally honest, like, I mean, it's just like I mean, and this is something that I've written about extensively on my website, is that I shameless plug, I'm afraid, sorry, is that it does just strike me that there is a sense of, well, the more chaos we create, the less likely the US is going to pull back. So to give you an example, I mean, obviously in the Gaza genocide, the US is supplying all of the weapon at enormous cost to itself, I might add. It is supplying all the weapons used by Israel in its brutal assault on the Palestinians. If you go back to October 8th, 2023, which is about 24 hours after Hamas broke out of Gaza and attacked Israel, there was a British journalist called Robert Peston, who is a classic example of someone who writes down whatever powerful people tell him. And he stated on social media that the attack on Israel is highly likely to lead to all-out war with Iran, and this crisis could spread well beyond the Middle East, and we're in the early stages of conflict with ramifications for much of the world. Now, how did his British intelligence sources know this? About 24 hours after Al-Aqsa floods, that was the Hamas operation, began, and days before the Israeli forces were deployed to Gaza. Like, how did they know that it was going to lead to all-out conflict with Iran, as we've just seen? Like, back then. But the point is that it was well understood that this would create enormous chaos, disruption to trade routes, probably even graver impact on the Britain's existing cost of living crisis and economic woes. But they went ahead and did it anyway. Project Alchemy, likewise, in the leaked documents we've reported on at Grayzone, they talk about how they knew that sanctions on Russia were going to destroy SWIFT, that they were going to result in a cost of living crisis in Britain, but they went ahead and did it anyway. I mean, it's as if there's some profit from chaos. Even if that profit is only the US coming to their rescue.
But it's the same in a way with Britain, with say France and Germany, that they've lost any sense of a distinctive French national interest or German national interest. They've all been subsumed into a kind of all-purpose Atlanticism. So it's actually supporting the United States in any and all circumstances, even though it doesn't actually in any way benefit Great Britain. And that's a relatively recent transformation, because you mentioned the Falklands, and that was, you know, at the time that it was touch and go. No one knew exactly how the Americans were going to come down, because, you know, Argentina was an ally and a
very close one.
Yeah, and so the Americans wanted to maintain the partnership with Argentina because Argentina was funding and training the Contras in Nicaragua, and so they didn't really know. It was the British finally persuaded them, hey, it's in your interest to support us, and then the Americans turned around. And so even back then, let's say go to the Mossadegh, the time when the overthrow of Mossadegh, it was the British who actually said, hey, it's in our interest, our oil interest that Mossadegh threatens. Initially, the Americans said, well, I don't know, you know, Mossadegh seems okay. But the British kept hammering them, said, he's a communist, this will be a victory of the Soviet Union. Finally, the Americans came around to the British point of view. It's now changed. The British now entirely just want to follow the lead of the Americans and do everything they can in order to facilitate the Americans. Just as the Germans, you know, the Germans, hey, they blew up our Nord Stream pipelines. Fine, good. Hurts us, but at least we keep the Atlanticist movement going.
Well, I mean, if I may, I mean, yeah, that like there is that kind of mass surrender aspect aspect to it, but it's like, but again, it you know, if we look at, say, like Germany, for instance, you know, they are heading for rearmament, potentially conscription, all sorts of, I mean, and Merz is engaging on all sorts of incendiary rhetoric about helping Ukraine strike inside Russia. Are they doing this to appease their masters in Washington, or is this them trying to act autonomously? Like, it's a fine line.
Well, Kit, you could also make the claim, and I'm beginning to warm to it, is they're just going to wait Trump out and hope for the best. That the next because there's a lot of moving pieces in this administration right now that could end in, I mean, blow up in its face. We don't need to go into it now, but looking at that the NATO summit, which I was aghast by it. I think most people were, but they're playing the long game. That's what it seems to me. And Merz is just playing his part here. I mean, this bombastic language. I mean, I think George and I reflected this is the most dangerous chancellor in Germany since Adolf Hitler. Just appalling was going. But it, you know, rearmament by 2035. Right? Yeah. Write me a check. Okay. I mean, no reasonable politician talks that way right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he obviously assumes that the EU will exist, you know, by 2035. But it's just, but again, it's like, I do think that I mean, if you go back to the early 90s, where you have the, you know, the kind of collapse of communism, there was a push towards trying to create an independent European military force. And the US made clear they were very unhappy about this. They didn't want Europe emerging as an independent military or economic power. And they also were very adroit about the fact that US military occupation of Europe was a means of breaking down barriers to access to European markets. So it's like, I mean, there was a report recently that I think that you following the strike on the US strikes on Iran, the US had given no direction to its European allies on how to interact with Iran moving forward, and they were stuck like headless chickens because they're used to being told exactly what to do.
Yeah, I think the thing that George just mentioned, this phenomenon of not thinking in terms of national interest and indeed doing things which are contrary to national interest, should not really be very mysterious to us now, because surely we've noticed this for decades. Instead, I think the beehive metaphor that Peter advanced a few minutes ago explains this. The beehive metaphor being or implying that there can be all kinds of cross-fertilization between otherwise not necessarily connected actors who take action, rather as Kit has been saying, in order to increase the power of the system and thereby, of course, their own power. So just as in a company, you're always trying to please your boss so that you get a pay rise and a promotion. The system can itself.
And you increase budgets.
Yes, exactly. So and that phenomenon, that and the beehive is a. I like that. I like that image for two reasons. Firstly, because indeed we know that bees kind of operate together without, as far as we know, being under the command of the queen or whatever. They do it, as it were, spontaneously. But I
much
also
like the British.
What?
I said much like the British.
Exactly.
Sorry, no.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, well, but I also like it for a very specific reason, and that is that there's a very brilliant French philosopher from the 1940s, Bertrand de Jouvenel, who wrote a book on power in, I think, 1953. And he describes power, the state, what we would call political power, as being so cannibalistic of its own structures that it is like a bear which destroys the honeycomb in order to get to the honey. So the state, or in this case, a collection of states, the system that they generate is now indeed destroying the beehive in order to extract the honey. We are in a system of extraction, whereby the system extracts at the expense, obviously, of citizens from the various countries, and where the actors in those countries absolutely do not think in terms of national interest. They think in terms instead of their own careers and of the system. And that's why the thing can have this self-generating and self-perpetuating quality to it, which I think is what Kit has identified by saying, and I very much like that theory as well, Kit, that it is the continual production of chaos, because that is, and there are plenty of American political scientists who have written this, from their point of view, American power is an imperative because the world is chaotic. And so if there were not this hegemonic projection, then the chaos will be even worse. So the chaos is indeed the prerequisite for the maintenance of hegemony. Go ahead, Kit.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think as well that, like, I mean, it just fits. You know, we just discussed the coup in Iran in 1953. I mean, it's rather forgotten that this followed the British were effectively waging war against Mossadegh in the early 1950s, and they were commandeering Iranian vessels or any vessels carrying Iranian oil on the basis that they were in possession of stolen property. And they drew up all sorts of plans to assassinate Mossadegh and overthrow him. In response, Mossadegh gave tours of the US where he was giving speeches comparing his battle against Britain for independence to the US's own. From 1776 onwards, and he got like glowing. He received a glowing reception from the media and audiences when he spoke publicly. So I mean, and I think that the story of that coup, which has led us to where we are now, actually, is Britain managing to manipulate the US to do its bidding to an extent, and also in return for a significant slice of British Petroleum's profits, which is no small thing. So yeah, I think the honeycomb metaphor is rather apposite, because yeah, there are elements within power structures all over the world who have shared interests and work together. They also might work against one another when it suits them. And I mean, particularly in again, to bring things back to Ukraine, as we've been discussing, there were very clearly elements of the US power structure, whether that's in the National Endowment for Democracy or the State Department, courtesy of Victoria Nuland, who of course now runs or is in a significant leadership position within the NED, who were viewing Ukraine as a potential beachhead to finally rid the world of Putin and break up Russia into easily manageable chunks. Britain was all in on this, and I mean, this has been a long-running objective of Britain to carve up Russian resources for its own benefit. This is exactly what happened when Britain and France and other countries invaded Russia following the Russian Revolution. That essay I mentioned on the Institute for Statecraft website, it was cited as expert insight in numerous State Department and Department of Defense reports on how to approach Russia. So again, it's like whether that's preaching to the converted or not is maybe a matter of interpretation. But as again, keeping with the Iraq analogy, the US wanted a pretext for invading Iraq. Well, Britain was more than willing to provide that. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was, we started this podcast with a satirical image of John Laughlin as the latest iteration of 007, which I thought was really cool. But I mean, how much difference does it really make? Because, it's amazing to me that we started with that graphic, because the British have this reputation, at least it's historical, during the Second World War, clandestine operations, when there was Operation Spiderweb, when we had these trains derailed, everybody said, oh, that's the British. They're really good at that. Okay. As if they would be proud of something like that. But that's beyond the point here. I mean, what difference does it really make? I mean, is it 007 or is it Keystone Cops? Or is it just kind of a propaganda layer for empire?
And could I, as a follow-up question, because we've only got a few more minutes left, we can't end without discussing the new head of MI6, Secret Intelligence Services.
Oh boy!
The conspiracy theory to end all conspiracy theories. Tell us about Blaise Metrovelli, Kit.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think that the fact that the media is digging into her, the mainstream British media is digging into her background to such an extent reflects the fact that they didn't want the independent media or indeed Russian media to get on this, because I mean, it is
the Daily Mail said that very explicitly. The Daily Mail wrote,
really?
Yeah, they wrote the whole thing, the story about her grandfather, and then at the end they had a long editorial saying, we're publishing this because we don't want the Russians to get to it first.
Wow. I actually
yeah, you can look at it. I'm sure it's still on their website.
Oh wow! But I know I'll check it out. But it's like, yeah, the effect. I mean, and okay, so yeah, effectively, Blaise is descended from a former Red Army. Her grandfather was with the Red Army, who defected to the Nazis and became known as the Butcher at a time when we know, and I've reported on this, that Britain was seeking to harness Ukrainian ultranationalism to try and unravel the Soviet Union, and again was willing to go further and collaborate with people like Stepan Bandera. The CIA didn't want anything to do with. Which is quite interesting. We have been told many times over and over again the MI6 chief, she never met her grandfather, or she didn't know him very well, which doesn't seem, particularly compelling or convincing. But I mean, it's certainly very interesting that she is now that she has been parachuted into this position after a relatively short spell by Richard Moore as C, the head of MI6, and she has this familial background which fits very neatly into what MI6 and the CIA have been doing in Ukraine, both during, in the immediate post-World War period, but also, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been to try and harness ultranationalism and separatism to sever Ukraine and Russia when, historically they are, fraternal nations.
What do we know about her Georgian? What do we know about the Georgian side? We understand about the Ukrainian grandfather on her. I believe it's on her. I've forgotten the family tree now. I think her mother remarried or something, and then Blaise took the surname of her stepfather, Metrovelli, but that's a Georgian name.
Yeah. Well, it's like Sopiko Japaridze, who is this wonderful Georgian journalist and an analyst. She's written a post for her Substack where she tracks potential familial connections between Blaise and Georgian ultranationalists who were again used as a what do you call it icebreakers to try and disintegrate. So to try and dissolve the Soviet Union. It's a long piece, and she's done an enormous amount of digging on this. I would urge people to check it out in full. And it's shockingly, there are some suggestions that she's related to people who are the of Georgian Legion, who are this fascist paramilitary group that boasts about executing Russian prisoners of war and posts videos of themselves doing it. So, again, if you want someone in this position who is going to, at all costs, carry on the Ukrainian proxy war, you couldn't think of a better person, really.
Could I just ask? Sorry, could I just interrupt? Just to go back to John's original question, why has there been so much interest in the story? Remember, Christopher Freeland, her grandfather, also had a very sordid Ukrainian nationalist past, and at the time when this came out, and she had been lying about it, and she lied and lied about it because she knows exactly who her grandfather was. There was hardly any kind of a fuss about this at all. It just came and went, and no one made any issue of it. Why this time there's been an issue about it?
Well, I like I say, I think that there was a deliberate attempt to head off the field day that would have been had by certain people. You got to bear in mind. I'm sure everyone on this panel is well aware, but Kaya Kallas likes to talk a lot about how, members of my family were victims of mass displacement after World War II. What were they doing in World War II, I wonder? Whose side were they on? Might they have been complicit in the Holocaust, perhaps? These are questions which are not being asked. But I think that with Blaise, the connections are writ so large, and it does stick in my mind that the first thing that you find when you Google Blaise's name is article after article saying she didn't know her grandfather. She didn't know him. She didn't know him, and it's just in the spirit of these things, as someone who's been an investigative journalist, if I dare say so myself, for about 10 years now, where you're being told not to look by the mainstream media is where you absolutely should be looking. So maybe some more things to come out. The Daily Mail managed to get hold of Nazi records on her grandfather. So these things are available. They are out there. It falls upon us to actually dig into them and see what might else be there that the Daily Mail et al. Might have conveniently ignored.
Very good. Well, Kit, we rely on you to find that out for us. Kit Klarenberg, thank you so much. Well done for all your work. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, everyone. See you all next week.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks so much, George. Take care.
Bye.